Hey, how's it going everybody? Welcome back to Aussie Fish Keeping. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about what substrate's actually the best for your aquarium. So obviously by the title and thumbnail of today's video, we're going to be talking in particular about sand and gravel, and we're going to be going over a few benefits and drawbacks of each of them. And we're basically just going to be talking about which one's best for your aquarium and which one I prefer to use in my aquariums. But yeah, I guess without any further ado, let's just jump straight into today's video. So sand and gravel are probably some of the most widely used substrate types in the aquarium hobby. Obviously sand's super great for aquascapes, planted tanks, all sorts of things like that. And gravel is once again great for aquascapes and tanks where you have heaps of fish in them. So before we do get into today's video, I will just quickly mention that both substrates are good. It's just depending on what you want to use them for. So I don't want to spoil too much, but they do definitely specialize in different sort of setups. So yeah, as for the first substrate we're going to be talking about, we're going to go over a few of the benefits and drawbacks of sand. So as for the first benefit of sand on our list, we've got that it actually doesn't need to be cleaned very often. So sand is a super compact substrate, and because of this, it doesn't get too dirty. So there's not too much fish waste or detritus getting under the sand. Obviously there is going to be like a little amount of like super tiny detritus that works its way down throughout the sand, but for the most part, like I said, it's very compact, so it's super hard for any sort of waste or just junk to get underneath that substrate layer. So because of that, you don't need to clean it as often, and it's actually best that you don't clean sand super often. So sand holds a bunch of beneficial bacteria, which we're going to hop into in a minute, but because of that, you don't actually want to be cleaning it too often, just because you can disrupt this beneficial bacteria or you can just kill it altogether. But yeah, benefit number one is definitely that it doesn't need to be cleaned often whatsoever. On to benefit number two, like I said 5 seconds ago, it does provide a growing ground for beneficial bacteria. So beneficial bacteria like Nitrobacter and Nitrosomonas. So sand has a super high surface area to volume ratio, which means it's got plenty of surfaces for this beneficial bacteria to grow on. And obviously in large and small aquariums, these beneficial bacteria are super important for keeping the nitrogen cycle stable. And without these beneficial bacteria, you can see fluctuations in your nitrogen cycle, which can be super dangerous for your fish. So yeah, sand does just provide a nice solid breeding ground for all this beneficial bacteria. So yeah, that's benefit number two. Sand does provide an absolutely amazing breeding ground for all sorts of beneficial bacteria. Moving on to benefit number three, sand actually does support better plant growth. So first things first, obviously it's a lot easier for plant roots to establish in a really compact substrate like sand, just because they can quite easily anchor themselves in and they're not going to be floating up to the surface. And if they do develop a nice strong root structure in the sand, they're able to take up all sorts of nutrients, which can help them grow and thrive a lot better in your aquarium. So that is why it's actually super important you have a great substrate in your aquarium if you're wanting to grow plants properly. And like I said, the sand is pretty compact, but it also does allow for the flow of oxygen and nutrients into and around the root balls of your aquarium plants. So benefit number three is that it does support super great plant growth. Moving on to our final benefit, and one of the reasons I like it so much is because it does actually allow for fish to sift through your substrate. So sand is pretty gentle and delicate, and most of the time it's not too abrasive, so it's not going to cut your fish's lips when they're trying to like pick it up and move it or sift through it. So fish that do this are things like African cichlids, American cichlids, Corydoras catfish, and like loaches and all sorts of things like that. So if you are keeping any of those aquarium fish, I would highly recommend getting sand, just because like I said, it's not abrasive and it's super delicate on their mouth, and it does allow for them to pick up all sorts of leftover fish food in the substrate, and it just allows for them to move it around if they're trying to build a little nest. As well as that, if you have fish species like spiny eels that like to dig in the sand, it does allow your fish to do that as well. So they're quite easily able to just dig throughout your sand and swim throughout it. So yeah, it's just a super great substrate to have for fish enrichment as well. But yeah, as for benefit number four, it's that it does allow your aquarium fish to actually sift through it. So that is most of the benefits. I hope I've covered all of them. There's definitely probably heaps of other benefits to sand out there, but I did want to try and keep this video pretty brief. So as for the drawbacks of sand, we do have a few of these as well. Although I wouldn't say they're major drawbacks, they're just something to consider if you are wanting to keep sand in your aquarium. So as for the first drawback, it's actually harder to be cleaned than gravel. So like I said before, one of the benefits is that it doesn't need to be cleaned often, but when you do need to clean it, it can be a little bit tricky. And the reason for that is because if you have a gravel vac, obviously the sand can quite easily be sucked all the way up the gravel vac and go into your bucket, unless you have like a super big, I don't really know that like bottom part of the siphon, I'm not too sure what it's called, but yeah, if you have a really big one of those, it shouldn't be a problem. But if you just have like an airline tube or just a small gravel vac, then it can be super hard to clean. So yeah, that's definitely drawback number one of sand. As for drawback number two, again, like I said before, it can trap a lot of that super small detritus. So when the detritus settles on your aquarium, either the water pushes it down or other fish just sift through your sand and push it down. But those small particles of detritus can work their way down through the sand. And if you aren't sifting your sand regularly, or you don't have fish in there doing it for you, then that detritus can get trapped. So I will just say that most of the time you're not even going to see this detritus. It's literally invisible, but when it does build up in larger quantities under your substrate, then once you start moving around things in your aquarium or working in your substrate, it can just be kicked up into the water column and become super messy and cloudy. So drawback number two is that it does trap a lot of that super small particle detritus. Moving on to drawback number three, this is one that I don't think is going to happen to many people whatsoever because it's not very common, but that's that it can be sucked up into your filters. So it's not going to be sucked up into things like sponge filters or really low powered or other really low powered filters, but if you have really big canister filters, it can be sucked up and it can clog the filters. Obviously that is easily avoidable if you just put the pipes for your filters a little bit higher than the sand, or you just make sure your filter is just higher than the sand. And another thing you can do is put some sort of fine mesh around your filter intake, and that's obviously going to stop the sand from being sucked up in there, although it may also stop other things that you want to be sucked up from being sucked up. So that's why sand can be a little bit annoying if you've got super high powered filters, and that's definitely another drawback. As for the final drawback on our list, it's that gas can actually build up in small pockets under your sand. So this happens if you don't have any bottom dwelling fish or things like that that are just constantly sifting through your sand, just because if that sand does stay undisturbed, all sorts of gases like hydrogen sulfide can build up in small pockets, and when the seals to those pockets are broken, it can be quite harmful for your fish. But a cheat code to this is just getting Malaysian trumpet snails. So I have these guys in my aquariums that I have sand in, and they're literally just a hack for solving that problem. So if you don't know what a Malaysian trumpet snail is, it's just like a little snail that's like cone shaped, and they literally just stay in your substrate all day. They do come out at nighttime when the lights are off, and they can like absolutely overtake your whole aquarium, but they're not harmful to anything, and they're actually super beneficial just because they do constantly sift throughout your substrate. So they are, number one, making sure none of those dangerous gas pockets build up, but number two, they're actually kicking up all that small detritus into your water column, which can make it a lot easier for your filter to suck up. But yeah, with that being said, that is definitely another drawback for sand. It's not very common, but if you don't have anything in there disturbing your sand constantly, it can become quite problematic. So with that being said, that's all the benefits and drawbacks there are to sand. Like I said before, there may be some that I've missed, and if there are, make sure to leave them in the comments down below. But I will just say I don't have much trouble with sand whatsoever. I absolutely love it. I think it looks super nice and natural, and it's very clean, and also it's great for your fish, plants, and all that beneficial bacteria in your aquarium. So moving on to gravel, in my opinion, it's not my favorite, although I actually have gravel in more of my tanks than sand, but I do definitely think there's less benefits and more drawbacks, but I'm not going to spoil it anymore. As for benefit number one, we have that it's a lot easier to clean. So obviously you can use a gravel vac. You can even just like move the gravel around in your aquarium, and that's just going to kick all that stuff stuck in or under your gravel up into the water column, and you can just suck that out with a siphon. And the reason it is easier to clean is because it's a lot bigger, so it's easy to kick stuff out of little pockets that are hidden under your gravel, and it doesn't trap things as easily just because if the water is running over it quite fast, so if you have a fast flow aquarium, nothing's really going to be able to settle into the nooks and crannies. Obviously you're going to get some little bits of detritus and things, but it's definitely a lot easier to clean than sand. So that is definitely one of the benefits to it. As for the next benefit on our list, we have that it's a lot denser than sand and allows for better oxygen flow to your plant plant roots. So, I mean, this one's pretty self-explanatory. It's not very dense, so a lot of oxygen and water can flow throughout it quite easily, and that obviously does allow an easy flow of nutrients and oxygen straight to your plant's roots, which can support your plant's growth. Although, in my opinion, it actually isn't really great for growing plants whatsoever. This is probably the only benefit when it comes to growing plants, because besides that, I don't really think it's useful for growing plants in my opinion, but there's obviously people out there who have had a lot of success with growing plants in gravel as well. And then as for the final benefit on our list, it's that it doesn't compact like sand, and that obviously doesn't mean it builds up that gas. So this means your fish are a lot safer in your aquarium, although like I said before, it's very uncommon for that to happen, especially if you have some sort of fish in there that's constantly moving the sand. But if you don't even want to take that risk, then gravel is definitely the best bet, and that's definitely another great benefit of having gravel in your aquarium. Moving on to the drawbacks of gravel, there's only 3 of these, just because gravel's not that cool in my opinion. But as for number 1, it's that it can be a lot more abrasive on your fish lips and fins and whatever. So not only can it be abrasive on the lips of the fish when they're trying to sift through it or pick it up and move it, but if they are just resting on the bottom, like flapping their fins a little bit, they can cut up their fins. Obviously it's super rare just because gravel's not usually sharp, but it's definitely more abrasive than sand in my opinion, and I have had instances where it does damage my fish's barbels on cories and fins on like longfin fish. But I would say it's very uncommon for that to happen unless your fish are bottom dwelling fish. Most of the time, if they're like a top dwelling fish, it's not really gonna bother them whatsoever, so you don't need to take that into account. But yeah, that's definitely one drawback of gravel. As for the second, it can trap a lot more larger debris if you don't have good water circulation. So when I mean larger debris, I mean like big long fish poops or bits of decaying organic matter like botanicals and stuff like that. So because it is bigger, it can create bigger pockets which can get that organic material trapped in it a lot easier than sand can. But like I said before, if you do have a nice strong flow of water pushing over your gravel, that shouldn't really happen. But if you do just have a sponge filter or something like that, debris can settle in your gravel and it can build up a lot more than in sand. And it can be harder to notice once that debris has built up, just because it's gonna work its way through the gravel down towards the bottom. And yeah, it's just gonna be harder to notice. So that is definitely the second drawback to gravel on our list. And then as for the final drawback, it's a lot heavier and it doesn't allow for your fish to sift and move through it. So this one, again, only really affects bottom dwelling fish or fish that do like to move the substrate, like earth eaters and other cichlids like that. And this sort of goes hand in hand with the first drawback, just because if your fish do try and move it, it is gonna injure them and it's not gonna be great. But most of the time they're not even gonna try, just because fish aren't stupid and they can see that it's a lot bigger. So they're not gonna be able to pick it up. And in some instances, this has actually happened to me once with one of my epistogrammas. I had them in a tank with gravel and it did try and pick up the gravel, except the gravel was like the perfect size. It just got lodged in its like mouth and throat. So it wasn't great. I did manage to get it out just by sort of holding my fish upside down and doing a bit of this, and it came out pretty easily, but it wasn't going to come out on its own and the fish was struggling quite a bit. Luckily he did survive, and yeah, the lesson was just don't keep earth eating fish with gravel. So yeah, that is definitely the third and final drawback on our list. But with that being said, that's gonna bring us to the end of today's video. So I hope you all enjoyed, and I hope this video helps you guys out. As for my opinion, I do much prefer sand, just because, like I said at the beginning, it looks a lot more natural and it's got much more benefits than gravel in my opinion. And most of the time sand is a lot cheaper, so you can even just buy it at a hardware store in like a massive bag, and that's super cheap. Whereas gravel, a lot of the time, if you're wanting some nice looking gravel, you're gonna have to go to an aquarium store, and that could be about 20 bucks for like a little 5 kilo bag. So it's a lot more expensive than sand. So if I was a beginner, I'd highly recommend getting sand, and I'd steer clear from that rainbow looking gravel. That stuff's absolutely diabolical. I absolutely hate that stuff. And yeah, sand's just #1 pick for me. But yeah, with that being said, if you did enjoy today's video, make sure to go down and subscribe, and while you're down there, smash the like button and comment your thoughts on today's video. I always go down there and read them all, and I try to reply back to every comment I get. Also, if you are looking for any fish, botanicals, aquarium essentials, make sure to go check out my website, aussiefishkeeping.com. We're gonna have some new guppies and apistos and all sorts of things coming up there soon. So yeah, I'll leave my link in the description, and if you wanna go check it out, please do. But yeah, with that said, I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you all for in that next video.